Imagine walking into the royal chapel and smelling not incense but death itself. Courtiers gagged, some vomited openly, and by dawn stray dogs had crept into the chamber, licking at the fluids leaking from King Henry VIII's coffin. This was no peaceful royal passing, this was horror. England's once golden prince, the radiant Renaissance monarch who sang, jousted, and dazzled Europe, ended as a grotesque giant, rotting from the inside out. But how did it happen? How did a man celebrated as the most handsome ruler in Christendom become a paranoid tyrant whose body literally exploded after death? Tonight, we uncover the chain of secrets, accidents, betrayals, and infections that rewired Henry's mind, poisoned his flesh, and left his court drowning in terror. What you are about to hear is the story they tried to hide for nearly 500 years. The smell hit first. It was not the ordinary staleness of a closed chamber, nor even the sour reek of unwashed bodies that filled so many Tudor halls. It was sharper, more insistent, a putrid wave that clawed into the throat and made eyes water. Courtiers, hardened by years in the service of a volatile king, found themselves gagging. Some staggered away, clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. Others could not contain themselves and vomited openly, their retching echoing against the gilded walls of Whitehall. What they smelled was the body of Henry VIII, England's once golden prince, already rotting before the candles around his bed had burned low. He had been dead only hours, yet the infection that had consumed him for more than a decade continued its grim work, accelerating now that the breath had left his body. The vast frame that had once filled armor and saddle now swelled grotesquely with gases, stretching skin until it threatened to split. This was not the serene image of royal death chroniclers would later present. It was horror, plain and undeniable. The scene reached a macabre climax when servants noticed a dark fluid seeping from the coffin, leaving a trail across the stone floor. Guards, accustomed to the blood and filth of battlefields, recoiled as the puddle grew. By dawn, whispers spread of dogs, strays that had crept into the chapel, lapping at the liquid. In Tudor England, where symbolism clung to every event, the sight was unbearable. The body of God's anointed king reduced to a feast for scavengers. And yet none of this would make it into the official record. The court scribes would describe a peaceful passing, a monarch laid to rest with dignity. They would not write that Henry's coffin had swelled and cracked like an overripe fruit. They would not note that those closest to the king covered their mouths in disgust, unable to endure the stench. For nearly 5 centuries, the truth remained hidden in private diaries, foreign ambassadors' reports, and the occasional whispered legend. Only with the discovery of suppressed medical notes and forensic analysis of his remains did the veil finally lift. It is hard to imagine this ending when one recalls Henry as he had once been, a dazzling young prince who rode effortlessly in tournaments, composed poetry, and debated theology with the greatest minds of Europe. To his contemporaries, he embodied the very promise of the Renaissance, strength, charm, and brilliance, but the spectacle of his death stripped away that illusion. No perfumed glove, no flattering portrait, no herald's proclamation could conceal the fact England's mighty king had died in filth, abandoned by dignity, undone by the very body that once symbolized his power. This grotesque finale forces us to ask, how did the radiant youth celebrated across Europe decay into such a monstrous figure, both in body and in soul? How did the king who had reshaped religion, who had married 6 queens, who had commanded armies and terrified popes, end his days as a putrefying giant whose corpse burst from its own coffin? The answer lies not in one single moment, but in a chain of events. accidents, illnesses, choices that rewired his mind, wrecked his flesh, and poisoned his kingdom. To understand how Henry became the horror lying in that coffin, we must begin not at his end, but at the moment everything changed, the tilt-yard of Greenwich Palace, January 1536. To grasp the full weight of Henry VIII's downfall, we must first remember who he was before the decline. In his youth, Henry was not the bloated tyrant painted by Holbein, nor the paranoid monster remembered in chronicles. He was Europe's golden prince, a man who seemed at first destined to embody all the virtues of a Renaissance king. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509 at just 17, England gasped in admiration. He was strikingly handsome, tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with reddish gold hair that glimmered in the sun. Courtiers described his complexion as beaming with health. He excelled in everything noble society valued. He hunted with unmatched vigor, jousted with terrifying skill, danced until dawn at courtly banquets. But his talents extended far beyond physical strength. Henry was also a scholar. He spoke Latin and French fluently, dabbled in Italian, and even wrote his own theological treatises. He composed music. One of his songs, Pastime with Good Company, became a popular court ballad. Erasmus himself praised Henry as a rare monarch whose intellect matched his birthright. England had not seen a ruler like him in generations. After the instability of the Wars of the Roses, here stood a king who promised strength and renewal. Chroniclers compared him to the legendary King Arthur. Foreign ambassadors marveled at his charisma. Even the Pope saw in Henry a champion of Catholic orthodoxy, awarding him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, for his early writings against Martin Luther. Yet beneath this radiant surface was a hunger for glory that would prove insatiable. Henry craved more than admiration. He wanted to be remembered as a king who rivaled Caesar and Charlemagne. His obsession with producing a male heir, with commanding armies in France, with reshaping the very soul of England's religion, all stemmed from this fierce desire to secure his name in history. That ambition, when coupled with the injuries and illnesses that ravaged his body later in life, would turn dangerous. It is here that we find the cruel irony. Henry's early reign was marked by restraint. He ruled in partnership with trusted advisers, executed relatively few nobles compared to predecessors, and remained married to Catherine of Aragon for 2 decades. For a time, he seemed every inch the model Renaissance monarch. But when we contrast this vibrant young king with the man who died screaming in Whitehall in 1547, the difference is staggering. What changed Henry was not merely the passage of time or the corruption of power. A single event, a violent accident on a frozen tilt-yard, set into motion his transformation from admired prince into the grotesque tyrant whose decaying body horrified his court. And so we turn to Greenwich Palace, January 24, 1536, where the thunder of hooves and the splinter of lances would alter not only Henry's fate, but the future of England itself. It was January 24, 1536, when England's destiny shifted in the space of a heartbeat. The winter sun cast long shadows over the tilt-yard at Greenwich Palace, where the king prepared to mount his war-horse. At 44, Henry was still formidable, over 6 feet tall, weighing close to 300 pounds when armoured. His presence on the field drew gasps of awe. His armour alone, crafted by the finest smiths of Milan, was worth more than a labourer could earn in a lifetime. To the crowd gathered that day, he appeared the very image of chivalry and power. The air buzzed with anticipation. Courtiers craned their necks, noble ladies clutched gloves and tokens, praying the king's lance would strike true. Across the barrier, Henry's opponent, another armoured noble, lowered his weapon. Trumpets blared, the ground shook beneath the hooves of 2 charging destriers, each beast bred for war, muscles straining under iron plates. For an instant, it seemed like the glorious tournaments of old, where kings proved their strength before God and nation. But fate intervened. The horses collided at full tilt, the impact as violent as a modern car crash. Henry was thrown, his massive armored body crashing onto the frozen earth. In the chaos, his own horse stumbled and fell, its iron-clad bulk slamming down upon him. Gasps turned to horrified silence. In that moment, England's king, God's anointed ruler, lay motionless in the dirt, pinned beneath the weight of beast and steel. Minutes stretched into eternity. Courtiers dared not move for fear of breaking protocol, or worse, of touching the king if he were already dead. Only whispers moved through the crowd. Was England now without a monarch? Panic rippled through the onlookers as physicians and attendants rushed forward, struggling to drag the horse away. At last, they uncovered the king's body. His visor was up, his face pale. No movement, no sign of breath. 2 hours passed in this dreadful uncertainty. 2 hours where England had no living ruler. 2 hours during which Anne Boleyn, heavy with child, waited in anguish for word of her husband's fate. She prayed desperately that he lived, not only for love, but because her unborn son might yet secure her place as queen. All of England held its breath with her. Then, against all odds, Henry stirred. He opened his eyes, relief surged through the crowd, but it was short-lived. Witnesses noticed something unsettling in his gaze. Gone was the warmth, the brightness that had once captivated Europe. Instead, a shadow lingered there, as though something deep within had shifted. When attendants tried to calm him, Henry erupted in anger, demanding to know why the joust had been stopped. Not gratitude, not relief, rage. That outburst was the first visible crack in the image of the Golden Prince. Those who knew Henry best would later swear the man who rose from that frozen tilt-yard was not the same as the one who had entered it. Something in him had broken, and though no one could yet see the full extent, that fall marked the true beginning of his long descent into tyranny, paranoia, and horror. Modern neuroscientists examining Henry's story believe that his 2 hours of unconsciousness were not simply a fainting spell, they were evidence of severe traumatic brain injury. The blow to his skull, the crushing weight of the horse and armor, likely damaged his frontal lobe, the very part of the brain responsible for personality, judgment, and impulse control. In an age without understanding of neurology, no one could diagnose it. But the symptoms were unmistakable. Before that January afternoon in 1536, Henry had been demanding yet measured. He could be ruthless, yes, but his ruthlessness was calculated, controlled. He had reigned for nearly 3 decades and executed far fewer nobles than many of his predecessors. He was capable of patience. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had lasted over 20 years, despite her repeated failures to give him a living son. His charisma was legendary. Ambassadors wrote of a king who could disarm with a smile, who spoke 4 languages, danced through the night, and debated scripture with the sharpness of a scholar. After the accident, that man seemed to vanish. In his place emerged a ruler prone to volcanic rage, sudden tears and terrifying mood swings. Courtiers began whispering of a king who could weep one moment and order executions the next. Anne Boleyn, the wife who had staked her future on giving him a son, found herself at the mercy of these storms. Just 4 months after Henry's fall, she was accused of adultery and treason, charges built on flimsy evidence but enforced with brutal efficiency. She was beheaded at the Tower of London, her fate sealed as much by Henry's darkened temper as by political manoeuvring. Nor was she alone. Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's most trusted minister and architect of his religious reforms, would later fall under similar wrath. Executed for treason, his head was displayed on London Bridge, another casualty of the king's unrelenting suspicion. The pattern was clear. The accident had not just scarred Henry's body, it had fractured his mind. Historical records now seem almost clinical in their consistency. Servants reported that Henry's outbursts came without warning. He would laugh at a jest, only to order the jester's flogging moments later. He would rage at imagined slights, suspecting poison in his food, betrayal in every corner. Where once he was the embodiment of Renaissance grace, he was now increasingly feared as a tyrant whose moods could not be predicted, let alone controlled. If the joust had been a battlefield wound, perhaps he could have been remembered as a tragic hero. Instead, it left him a changed man, one whose paranoia and violence would scar England itself. The fall of 1536 was more than a personal accident. It was the pivot point of a nation's history. In that instant, the course of Henry's reign veered toward blood, fear, and decay. And yet, the brain injury was only half of the disaster. For in the very same accident, another old wound was torn open, one that would never close again, one that would fester until it consumed him from the inside out. The jousting accident of 1536 did not only shatter Henry's mind, it awakened an older injury that would prove far more deadly. Years earlier, he had suffered a wound to his leg in another tournament, a deep gash that healed but left a faint scar. For most men, it would have been a forgettable hurt, a mark of youthful bravado. But when the horse crushed him at Greenwich, that fragile scar split wide open, and the wound never truly closed again. In an age without antibiotics, even a minor cut could become lethal. Infection lurked everywhere, in the unwashed hands of physicians, in the damp linens of bedchambers, in the very air of a Tudor palace where open fires, chamber pots, and refuse bred constant filth. What began as a painful but manageable ulcer grew into a festering sore that haunted Henry until the day he died. Contemporary accounts describe the wound with words that curdle the stomach. Court physician Thomas Vicary recorded ulcers, grievous, stinking, and most painful. Each day, attendants were forced to drain the king's leg, sometimes twice daily, filling bowls with pus and foul-smelling fluid. The odour was so powerful that courtiers nearby would gag or flee the chamber altogether. Imagine the humiliation for a man who had once been the epitome of physical prowess. Henry, the warrior who thundered across battlefields, was now reduced to hiding his rotting flesh behind silken stockings and layers of perfume imported from Arabia. Rose oil, ambergris, musk. All were poured onto his body in a desperate attempt to mask the stench. Yet nothing could disguise the truth. The King of England was decaying while still alive. Worse still, the pain was relentless. Chronic ulcers are no minor discomfort. The slightest touch of a bedsheet could feel like fire against raw skin. Walking became agonizing. Standing for long ceremonies was impossible. The king who once led hunts and tournaments was increasingly confined to chambers, forced to watch others enjoy the life he once embodied. Each step was a reminder of his decline, each night a torment of throbbing, burning agony. The wound did more than disfigure Henry's leg, it poisoned his soul. Frustration turned to paranoia. Suffering twisted into cruelty. And as the years dragged on, the ulcer became not just a medical problem, but a symbol of his entire reign, a monarchy outwardly wrapped in silk and gold, but beneath it festering, rotting, and ready to collapse. This, then, was the hidden legacy of the jousting fall. It had not only broken Henry's mind, it had torn open a passage for infection, one that would steadily poison his body, his court, and his kingdom. What began as an ulcer would end as a nightmare. Day after day, the ritual repeated itself. Servants, their faces pale and scarves pressed to their noses, entered the king's chamber carrying bronze bowls. With practiced hands, they unwrapped the bandages from his swollen legs, revealing ulcers that oozed with foul discharge. The smell was indescribable, an acrid stench that clung to the air long after the doors were closed. Each wound was drained, pus collected until the bowls were full, then hurriedly whisked away so the monarch would not be reminded of the filth flowing from his own body. But Henry knew. How could he not? Every movement reminded him. Silk sheets, once a luxury of comfort, became torment. The brush of fabric across his sores was agony. He would lash out at attendants who accidentally touched the raw flesh, their lives endangered by his fury. Pain had become his constant companion, shaping his moods as surely as politics or faith. And yet, for all this decay, Henry clung to the illusion of vigor. His vanity refused to yield. He ordered his portrait painters to capture him in impossible poses, standing tall, legs apart in the famous power stance, thighs depicted as strong and muscular, as in his youth. No canvas would show the truth, that beneath his robes his legs were rotting away. He designed special stockings stuffed with padding to disguise the swelling. He had perfumers create elaborate mixtures of rose oil, ambergris, and musk to drown the smell of decay. His very image became a lie, a carefully staged mask of strength over a body in collapse. This concealment was not only for the public, but for himself. Henry feared what the wound meant, that his body, once a weapon of power, was betraying him. For a Renaissance prince who had measured his worth in jousts won and hunts pursued, to be crippled by disease was a humiliation almost too great to bear. He sought remedies, insisting on compressive devices made with lead weights to force the wounds shut. In truth, these contraptions only worsened his condition, cutting off circulation and accelerating infection. Behind the glitter of courtly ceremony, the reality grew ever more grotesque. The infection spread, seeping into his bloodstream, poisoning not just his body but his mind. Physicians of the time had no language for sepsis, but they saw the effects: fevers that came and went without cause, sweats that drenched the king's sheets, mood swings that defied explanation. To live in Henry's presence became to live in constant fear, for no one could predict when the agony in his leg would twist into fury in his voice. Thus the great monarch, who once embodied the glory of Renaissance manhood, was reduced to a prisoner of his own body. The ulcer was more than a wound, it was a slow rot that defined the final decade of his reign. It made every chamber he entered smell of corruption. It made every gesture of power a charade, and it marked the beginning of a decline that neither wealth, nor medicine, nor divine right could halt. The wound was not merely a surface affliction, it was a gateway. Each day, as pus was drained from Henry's legs, unseen toxins slipped silently into his bloodstream. Modern physicians studying the records believe he suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone-deep infection that released a constant stream of bacteria and poisons into his body. In Tudor England, without antibiotics, such an infection was not just an illness. It was a slow, merciless executioner. The effects were devastating. Imagine the worst toothache you have ever endured, sharp and relentless, keeping you awake for nights. Now spread that agony through both legs, never stopping, never easing, gnawing at bone and muscle day after day for over a decade. That was Henry's reality. Pain became his shadow, shaping his moods as much as counselors or queens. But the infection did more than torture his body. It poisoned his mind. Contemporary observers began to describe behavior that was not simply temperamental, but terrifyingly unstable. One moment he would roar with laughter at a jest, the next he would order the jester whipped for insolence. He accused loyal servants of poisoning him. He suspected treachery in every corner, adultery in every marriage, assassination in every shadow. What had begun as physical decay now seeped into his very psyche. Medical analysis today suggests that the toxins crossing into his brain triggered neurological damage, violent mood swings, paranoia, and delusions. These were not choices but symptoms of a body slowly poisoning itself. Yet to his court they appeared as the whims of a tyrant. Ministers walked on eggshells, unsure if the king who greeted them with charm would dismiss them with gold or send them to the scaffold. Henry himself seemed dimly aware that something was wrong. He raged at physicians for failing to heal him, promising them lands and riches if they found a cure. When they could not, he accused them of treachery. His paranoia became ritual. He hired food tasters for every meal, demanded that ointments be tested on servants before touching his skin, inspected his pus-soaked bandages as if searching for signs of poison planted by invisible enemies. And yet, even in this madness, the machinery of power continued. Treaties were signed, wars waged, queens married and discarded. But behind each decision lurked the same shadow. A man ruled as much by infection as by ambition. His kingdom was governed by a body in revolt, a body whose corruption was written not only on his skin but in every law, every execution, every fear-filled glance from those who served him. The Golden Prince had long since vanished. In his place sat a monarch racked by pain, his veins carrying not the lifeblood of kingship, but the steady drip of poison. And as the infection deepened, so too did the grotesque theatre of his life, none more evident than in his pursuit of youth and beauty, even as his own flesh crumbled into rot. By the early 1540s, Henry's body was a battlefield of pain and infection, yet his appetite for power, dominance, and desire had not diminished. If anything, his suffering only sharpened his obsession with controlling those around him. Nothing revealed this more starkly than his pursuit of wives, particularly his fixation on youth and beauty, even as he himself was collapsing into decay. At 50 years old, obese, crippled, and reeking of disease, Henry turned his gaze upon Catherine Howard, a girl barely 17. The grotesque contrast was impossible to ignore. England's monarch, swollen and foul-smelling, requiring servants to lift him onto a horse, now wooing a teenager who had barely reached womanhood. Reports from the time suggest Catherine endured her royal husband only with the help of strong wine. In private, she whispered of her revulsion. In public, she had no choice but to play the role of the adoring bride. This union was not an isolated episode, but a pattern. 6 marriages in total: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Each relationship told the story of a man who measured his worth not in faithful partnership, but in domination. For Henry, wives were both symbols of prestige and scapegoats for his own failures. When Catherine of Aragon could not give him a son, he broke with Rome itself, unleashing a religious revolution that would tear England apart. When Anne Boleyn's wit and charm turned against him, he silenced her with the sword. When Jane Seymour bore him a male heir, but died in childbirth, he dressed her memory in sainthood while moving on to the next conquest. By the time Catherine Howard entered his life, the pursuit had become almost grotesque theatre. His court, filled with young courtiers and ambitious nobles, watched in uneasy silence as the bloated king paraded his teenage queen. They whispered behind fans and sleeves, wondering how long this bride would survive his temper. The king's paranoia was now so great that even the faintest rumor of Catherine's past flirtations became fatal. Within 2 years, she was accused of adultery and beheaded, another victim sacrificed to Henry's decaying pride. There is something pitiful, almost tragic, in this grotesque pursuit. Henry, once the golden youth of Europe, could not bear the truth of his decline. Surrounded by fresh-faced girls, he sought to reclaim what his body had stolen from him: vigor, beauty, vitality. But each marriage only underscored the same reality. His own flesh was betraying him, and no bride, however young, could turn back time. The infection in his legs worsened, his weight ballooned, his mind darkened further. And soon his ulcers would cross a terrible threshold, transforming from chronic misery into something far more monstrous, the stench of death itself. By 1542, Henry's condition reached a threshold that horrified even those accustomed to his decay. For 6 years his ulcers had been painful but manageable, if revolting. Now they worsened beyond recognition. The discharge, once yellow-white, turned green, then brown. Court physician Thomas Vicary noted a change in odour so severe that he described it as the very stench of death. This was no longer a chronic sore. It was a septic wound, an open portal for corruption that consumed the king from within. The consequences rippled outward. Unable to ride or hunt, Henry turned to gluttony as his only relief. Food became both comfort and distraction, and he consumed it with desperation. Records show feasts groaning with roasted meats, sugared confections, spiced wines. The weight piled on. From an already massive 280 pounds, he swelled past 350. His armour bears witness. The suit preserved from 1540 reveals a 48-inch waist, yet only 5 years later new armour had to be commissioned with a staggering 54-inch waist. To put that into perspective, his waist measured wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace itself bent under his bulk. At Hampton Court, doorways were widened, beams reinforced to keep floors from sagging beneath him. Special chairs were constructed with removable arms because he could no longer squeeze between them. He was dressed lying in bed, his massive limbs manipulated by 4 servants at once. A pulley and sling system was devised to lift him into position, transferring him into a wheeled chair that was carefully concealed from public view. The image of a vigorous Renaissance monarch had become an elaborate charade, and yet the performance had to go on. The Tudor court was a stage where power was enacted daily through spectacle. Henry, even in misery, insisted on the ritual of majesty. He appeared in rich fabrics, dripping with jewels, his face painted with authority. But those who drew near knew the truth. Behind the incense burning in the great halls, behind the perfumes poured on his robes, was a reek that betrayed him. The odour of septic flesh clung to him like a shadow. Courtiers developed discreet strategies to endure his presence, holding pomanders filled with herbs and perfumes, excusing themselves when nausea overcame them. This was more than a medical crisis. It was a political one. A king was not merely a man, he was the body politic, the embodiment of the realm itself. And Henry's body was failing spectacularly. His decay threatened not only his life, but the dignity of monarchy itself. The kingdom watched as its sovereign transformed from warrior prince to grotesque invalid, and still no one dared speak the truth aloud. The septic ulcers marked the turning point of his reign. No longer could the illusion of strength be maintained without extraordinary deceit. Every decision, every marriage, every act of cruelty from this point forward was filtered through a haze of pain and infection. England was ruled by a man whose flesh was rotting away, even as he sat upon the throne. By the mid-1540s, Henry's body was no longer capable of sustaining the role of an active king. He could not ride at the head of his armies, could not mount a horse without mechanical aid, could not even stand for long without trembling from the pain in his legs. And yet, the image of majesty had to be preserved. Thus began one of the most elaborate deceptions in Tudor history, the stage management of a monarch whose body was collapsing. Each morning, the ritual of dressing, the lever, was transformed into a military operation. Where once Henry strode from his bedchamber to his wardrobe, servants now clustered around him as he lay sprawled across his mattress, unable to rise. 4 men lifted his enormous limbs into stockings and breeches, shifting his bulk like a living statue. Once clothed, he was strapped into harnesses attached to pulleys hidden behind embroidered curtains. Slowly, with the creak of ropes and the strain of wood, the king was hauled upright, then deposited into a specially designed wheeled chair. But this reality was never to be seen by the public. When Henry appeared before his subjects, the performance was seamless. He emerged in glittering robes, walking a few painful steps with the aid of canes, while trumpeters blared and heralds proclaimed his might. Behind the scenes, attendants discreetly held him steady, ready to catch him should his legs buckle. When foreign ambassadors were present, the charade became even more intricate. Henry would sit upon a throne elevated just enough to conceal that he had been wheeled into place. Palaces themselves became complicit in the performance. At Hampton Court and Whitehall, ramps were constructed, corridors widened, secret doors carved for the passage of wheeled chairs. None of these adaptations were acknowledged openly. To admit them was to admit the king's weakness, something unthinkable in an age when the monarch embodied divine power. The court played along, for their lives depended on it. To hint at the truth was dangerous, to laugh fatal. Diplomats noted the peculiar stiffness of ceremonies, the way courtiers seemed to hold their breath in the king's presence, fearful not of what he might say, but of what he might reveal by faltering. Even the art of portraiture became propaganda. Painters continued to depict Henry in the stance of a warrior, legs wide, one hand upon his hip, projecting the illusion of vitality. The king demanded this lie, for he could not bear to see himself as he truly was. Yet beneath the silks and trumpets, beneath the carefully choreographed appearances, Henry was a man confined by agony, humiliation, and rot. His world had shrunk to the size of his chambers, his throne transformed into a cage. Still the deception continued, because to show the truth of Henry's body would have been to show the weakness of England itself. But though his attendants could disguise his failing legs, they could not disguise his mind. And as the infection deepened, Henry's thoughts grew darker, his paranoia more vivid, his terrors more grotesque. The king's body was a ruin. Now his mind began to follow. By 1544, the mask of dignity could no longer conceal what was happening inside Henry's mind. Pain and poison had seeped beyond the body. They now gripped his thoughts. Courtiers who once feared his temper now whispered of something darker, madness. At first, the signs were subtle. Sudden silences in the middle of conversation, as if he were listening to someone unseen. Then came the outbursts. Witnesses described Henry holding full arguments with empty air, gesturing furiously at chairs as though occupied by invisible enemies. On one occasion he was overheard pleading with his long-dead mother, Elizabeth of York, begging her guidance. Another time he berated his father, Henry VII, defending the extravagance of his own reign against imagined accusations. Most chilling were the apparitions of those he had executed. Several ambassadors reported that the king would halt mid-sentence, his face draining of colour as he stared at some phantom only he could see. "Leave me," he would whisper hoarsely, before exploding into rages against his bewildered counsellors. One French envoy wrote of Henry suddenly shouting at an empty chair, accusing Anne Boleyn's ghost of mocking him. "I took your head once," he bellowed. "I'll take it again." Paranoia saturated every corner of his existence. He was convinced his servants were poisoning him, not only through his meals but even through the bandages on his legs. He demanded that the pus-soaked wrappings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. Medicines became objects of terror. Ointments and salves were first tested on unlucky attendants. Only when they survived would the king consent to touch them. Court life became a theatre of fear. Ministers tiptoed through audiences, weighing every word lest they spark one of Henry's uncontrollable furies. Pages and guards devised discreet signals to warn each other of the king's mood, a nod, a shift of ribbon, the subtle tilt of a hand. Those closest to him lived in constant dread, for a man who could not trust his own senses was unlikely to trust anyone else. The transformation was complete. Once a Renaissance prince admired across Europe, Henry had become a haunted tyrant, his every word shaped by pain, paranoia, and visions of the dead. England was ruled not by reason, nor even by politics, but by a body and mind rotting together. And yet, this descent into delusion was only part of his unravelling. The king's obsession with death, with the grotesque imagery of decay, began to seep into his very image, captured forever in the most famous portrait of his reign. Of all the artifacts that survive from Henry's reign, none is more iconic than the Whitehall portrait. Painted late in his life by Hans Holbein's workshop, it depicts Henry as we still imagine him today, broad-shouldered, legs braced apart in a stance of dominance, eyes staring with cold authority. It is the image of a monarch unbroken, a king who towers over his court even in his later years. But beneath the surface of this painting lies a disturbing truth, one deliberately concealed for centuries. In 1960, restorers X-raying the canvas discovered something astonishing. Beneath the painted layers, Henry's left hand had originally held not a simple cane, but a wooden staff topped with a skull. A walking stick transformed into a memento mori, a grotesque reminder of mortality. This was no artistic flourish. According to court accounts, Henry had indeed carried such a staff in his final years. It was said to be fashioned from the remains of a monk from one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved, though others whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The image is almost unbearable to contemplate. The King of England, bloated and stinking, hobbling through his palaces while tapping a skull-topped cane against the floor. Some courtiers described the sound as a nervous tick, a rhythm that unsettled even the boldest men. To see the monarch, God's chosen ruler, leaning on death itself as he shuffled through the corridors, this was a vision of power transformed into grotesquerie. Holbein, ever precise, captured the truth. But after Henry's death, his son Edward VI ordered the detail painted over. He did not want the realm to remember his father as a death-obsessed madman. Instead, he demanded that the portrait project the illusion of authority, even in decline. Thus the skull was replaced with a plain stick, the grotesque detail erased from official memory. For centuries the lie endured, and yet that hidden skull is perhaps the most truthful symbol of Henry's final years. It speaks of a king consumed by death, haunted by ghosts both real and imagined, clinging to power even as his body betrayed him. It reveals the fear at the heart of his reign, that all his wars, his wives, his break with Rome, his endless grasp for legacy could not protect him from the same fate as every other mortal man. The portrait still hangs today, still radiating power. But now, knowing what it once showed, we can see through the illusion. We see not the invincible monarch, but the terrified man behind the mask, obsessed with mortality, already rehearsing his own death. By the mid-1540s, Henry's court lived in a state of constant dread. The once vibrant centre of pageantry and learning had transformed into a theatre of fear, where every whisper, every movement, even the smallest accident could decide life or death. The king's moods, unmoored from reason, became the weather to which the entire kingdom bent. Courtiers developed an unspoken code to survive. Pages stationed outside the king's chamber would discreetly signal his disposition with colored ribbons, red for rage, black for depression, white for rare moments of calm. Diplomats waiting to present petitions adjusted their words according to the hue they glimpsed as the chamber doors opened. Even the most powerful nobles moved like actors on a dangerous stage, forced to perform obedience with flawless precision lest they trigger his fury. The consequences of a misstep were swift and merciless. A servant who sneezed in the royal presence was dragged away and interrogated as if he were an assassin. A lady-in-waiting who stepped clumsily on the hem of the king's robe was banished, her family stripped of lands. Paranoia reigned, poison was suspected in meals, betrayal in glances, treason in silence. The atmosphere thickened with tension until the simplest acts became perilous. Most chilling of all were the executions Henry ordered for those already dead. His mind, slipping between delirium and lucidity, sometimes forgot who had fallen beneath his axe. He would bellow accusations against men long buried, demanding their punishment. Courtiers, frozen with terror, would murmur reassurances, never daring to correct him outright. To tell the king he was wrong was to risk joining the ghosts that haunted him. One banquet in November 1546 revealed just how far he had descended. As the French ambassador recorded, Henry suddenly rose, an agonizing feat requiring several attendants to haul him to his feet, and glared at an empty chair across the table. His face contorted, spittle flying as he screamed, "You dare show your face at my table, witch?" The hall went silent. Every eye followed the king's hand as he pointed at nothing, cursing Anne Boleyn's ghost with renewed threats of execution. Then, as if the eruption had never happened, he collapsed back into his seat and resumed eating, tearing meat with yellowed teeth while the court sat frozen in horror. This was the world Henry's subjects inhabited, a palace where ghosts walked, where reason had no anchor, where even the most loyal servant might be condemned in a heartbeat. England was no longer ruled by law or policy, it was ruled by the unpredictable storms of a rotting king. By January of 1547, Henry's body had become a battlefield utterly lost to decay. The ulcers on his legs, once merely grotesque, now gaped so wide that attendants could see down to the bone. The skin surrounding them had turned black, the unmistakable sign of gangrene. Every dressing change filled the chambers with a stench so overwhelming that servants fainted. Windows were flung open despite the freezing winter air, yet still the odor lingered. His body swelled monstrously. The infection poisoned his blood, and his kidneys and liver began to fail. Fluid accumulated in his abdomen, distending it until even breathing became an effort. His legs ballooned, the skin splitting and leaking clear fluid through layers of linen. The once athletic figure, who had thundered across jousting fields and ridden at the head of armies, now lay bloated and immobile, a grotesque parody of his youth. Even his face betrayed the corruption within. Contemporary reports describe it as swollen to nearly twice its natural size, the features distorted, the once bright eyes yellowed and sunken in pouches of discolored flesh. His tongue swelled so badly that his speech slurred into gargling noises barely comprehensible. His breath reeked of rotting meat, a sure sign the infection had invaded his digestive tract. But perhaps most tragic was his mind in these final weeks, staggering between painful clarity and delirious terror. In rare lucid moments, Henry grasped that death was closing in. He begged his physicians to save him, promising wealth beyond imagining if they could perform a miracle. When they failed, he turned on them with fury, threatening torture and execution, though by then he lacked the strength to sign the warrants. When delirium overtook him, the king revealed the full depth of his terror. He cried out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, as if she might still protect him. He spoke to his long-dead brother Arthur, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he called for Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had cast aside and left to die alone. In these moments, the great tyrant sounded less like a king and more like a frightened child, surrounded by ghosts of his own making. And yet, even as his body rotted and his mind faltered, the machinery of monarchy maintained the illusion. Official proclamations described him as merely resting, recovering from a minor ailment. Ambassadors were reassured that the king would soon receive them. Behind the curtain of ceremony, however, the Privy Council was already plotting the succession, knowing the king's life was measured not in months, but in days. Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, had become a husk of flesh and fear. His organs failed one by one, his spirit swung between desperate bargains and haunted visions. And as January dragged on, the court braced for what everyone knew was inevitable, the final hours of a king who had ruled by terror and now faced death in terror himself. The end came not with dignity, but with convulsions that shook the very bed beneath him. On the night of January 27, 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned urgently to Whitehall. The king was dying, and the last rites were needed. When Cranmer entered the royal chamber, what he found was more horror than holy vigil. Henry's massive body thrashed violently, seizures racking him with such force that 6 men struggled to hold him down. The reinforced bed frame, built to bear his enormous weight, cracked under the strain. Between spasms, he vomited black bile that splattered the sheets and filled the chamber with a stench so foul that Cranmer himself was forced to retreat twice to vomit in the corridor. The man who had commanded armies and reshaped a nation now lay helpless, his body convulsing like a condemned soul in torment. When the seizures paused, Henry would open his eyes, staring at visions only he could see. He cried out for his lost children, the stillbirths and miscarriages that had haunted his desperate quest for an heir. "Forgive me," he begged. "I will be a better father. Only come back to me." Then his voice would shift to a higher, panicked tone, screaming about flames, demanding that someone extinguish the fire consuming him. At times, his lucidity returned, sharp and terrifying. He clutched Cranmer's sleeve, gasping promises of wealth and power if the archbishop could save him. He raged at his physicians, spitting accusations of incompetence and treason. And then, as if a curtain dropped, he slipped back into delirium, speaking to Arthur, his long-dead brother, or to Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had abandoned. The chamber was filled with ghosts summoned by his guilt and fear. As midnight passed, Henry's breathing changed. It became ragged, punctuated by a wet, gurgling sound, the dreaded death rattle as fluid filled his lungs. Cranmer leaned close, performing the last rite of comfort. He asked the king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. Henry's swollen hand, heavy and trembling, squeezed Cranmer's fingers once, then fell limp. At 2:07 a.m. on January 28, 1547, the king who had executed wives, defied popes, and terrorized his kingdom was dead. But his death was not the peaceful release recorded in official proclamations. It was a night of seizures, visions, bile, and screams, a passing so horrifying that it was deliberately concealed from history for centuries. Yet the true nightmare had only just begun. for Henry's corpse, steeped in years of infection and decay, did not rest quietly. In death, as in life, it erupted into grotesque spectacle. Death brought no peace to Henry VIII. In fact, his body seemed to collapse faster once life had fled it, as though the infection that had ravaged him for years finally ran free, unopposed. Within hours, the enormous corpse began to swell, bloated with gases produced by bacteria feeding on dead flesh. The stench, already unbearable in life, intensified until servants stationed outside his chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council faced an impossible problem. The official narrative required a solemn lying in state, a monarch displayed to his people in dignity. But what lay in the chamber was no kingly sight. It was a mass of corruption deteriorating at terrifying speed. They decided to hide the truth. Henry's death was kept secret for 3 days, while embalmers worked frantically, racing against decay. What they found when they opened the body confirmed the horror. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed notes, uncovered centuries later, describe a spectacle of collapse, a liver so enlarged and diseased it crumbled at a touch, a heart swollen to twice its natural size, surrounded by yellow fluid, intestines black with gangrene. One assistant fainted outright when the abdomen was cut, releasing such a wave of stench that others fled the room, gagging. The embalmers resorted to desperate measures. They packed the body cavity with more than 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs, trying to dry and mask the rot. They wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth, soaked in turpentine, then sealed it inside a massive lead coffin designed to hold the sheer weight. Still, the gases built. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, attendants reported strange sounds, pops, gurgles, creaks, as the coffin strained against its monstrous contents. Witnesses later recalled seeing the metal bulge outward, a grotesque swelling hidden quickly beneath heavy black drapes. Even the rituals of royal mourning turned surreal. Courtiers burned barrels of incense in the halls to battle the odor, yet the stink of corruption seeped through. Diplomats in attendance noted the pallor of attendants, the way noblewomen pressed pomanders to their noses with trembling hands. The fiction of a serene monarch at rest was impossible to maintain. Everyone who drew near knew the truth, even if no one dared to speak it aloud. The king's body, once celebrated as the vessel of divine authority, had become a spectacle of human ruin. It was as if the corruption that had poisoned his reign now demanded its final performance, played not on a tilt-yard or battlefield, but within his very coffin. And the worst humiliation was still to come. The funeral procession that carried Henry VIII to his final resting place was unlike any England had seen before. His coffin, reinforced with heavy lead to contain both the king's bulk and his accelerated decay, weighed nearly half a ton. 8 great horses strained to pull the specially constructed carriage, their hooves sinking into the mud of winter roads. What should have been a day's solemn journey to Windsor stretched into 3, the slow crawl of death across a rain-soaked landscape. On the second night, the cortege halted at Sion Abbey, ironically one of the very monasteries Henry had dissolved in his ruthless break with Rome. The coffin was placed in the chapel, guarded by attendants who lit candles and muttered prayers over the bloated king within. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Everyone knew the corpse was rotting too quickly. Everyone smelled what the perfumed herbs and incense could not conceal. And then it happened. The pressure of gases inside the decomposing body built against the sealed lead until the coffin itself could no longer contain it. With a sound witnesses later compared to a thunderclap, the metal split. Putrid liquid burst forth, pooling across the chapel floor in a dark, foul-smelling tide. Guards gagged and stumbled back, some fleeing into the night air, retching violently. When dawn broke, The horror deepened. Stray dogs had slipped into the chapel under cover of darkness. They were discovered licking at the fluids that had seeped from the coffin, scavenging from the very body of the king who had once styled himself God's anointed on earth. The sight chilled witnesses to the marrow. To the superstitious minds of the Tudor age, it was more than an accident. It was judgment. Henry, who had broken with Rome and dissolved monasteries, was now reduced to carrion for beasts within the ruins of a monastery he himself had destroyed. Panic spread among the attendants. Sawdust and lime were thrown across the floor to soak up the filth. The coffin was hastily resealed with additional sheets of lead, though everyone knew the dignity of the monarch was already lost. The grotesque tale travelled quickly through whispers and foreign ambassadors' letters, becoming legend. And yet, unlike most legends, it was true. By the time the coffin finally reached Windsor, the pageantry of royal burial was little more than a hollow ritual. Beneath the black drapes behind the solemn prayers lay not majesty, but humiliation. A king who had sought immortality, brought low by rot, his corpse bursting apart, his remains defiled by dogs. It was the last ghastly symbol of Henry's reign. A man who had ruled with terror, who had made himself larger than life, ended in a spectacle of decay that no crown could conceal. When Henry's coffin finally reached Windsor, the court moved quickly to erase the humiliation of Sion Abbey. Witnesses were sworn to silence on pain of death. The official proclamations told of a peaceful passing, of a king buried with honor and ceremony befitting God's anointed. The truth, that his coffin had burst, that dogs had licked at his remains, was buried as deeply as the king himself. Edward Seymour, soon to become Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector for the boy King Edward VI, understood the stakes. England could not afford to let the image of monarchy collapse with the body of its most famous ruler. So the narrative was rewritten. Chroniclers recorded solemn dignity, foreign ambassadors were reassured, and portraits continued to project Henry as the immovable colossus he had once been. The grotesque reality was hidden in private diaries and hushed reports, left to surface centuries later. But history has a way of unearthing what power tries to conceal. We now know Henry VIII did not die in serenity, but in agony, raving through visions, drowning in his own corruption. We know his body did not rest in noble repose, but burst apart in a flood of decay. We know that the king, once hailed as the handsomest prince in Christendom, ended not as a figure of majesty, but as carrion, his final remains lapped up by dogs. It is a story both horrifying and profoundly human. For Henry's reign was built on the illusion of invincibility, the invincible warrior, the unchallengeable tyrant, the godlike monarch. His body was central to that image, his size, his strength, his virility. When that body failed, it exposed the truth behind every throne and crown. Even the mightiest king cannot escape the rot of flesh. And so Henry VIII, the man who defied the Pope, who remade a nation's faith, who broke wives and nobles alike, ended as a bloated shell, hidden by black cloths and silenced witnesses. His life is remembered for power and fear, but his death reminds us of something deeper, that all power, no matter how absolute, is temporary, and even kings are reduced to dust and memory. The Golden Prince had become the grotesque tyrant, and at last the grotesque tyrant became nothing more than a body rotting in the dark.